This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam peoples.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is November 25th, 2021, and this is episode 267.
I'm Scott Lindenbaum.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, the House of Commons is back as the BC legislature rises. They may as well have just gone from Victoria to Ottawa because the politics is all just moved east again. We're done working here, and they're only just getting started. Thank you to everyone who keeps the show going with your donations monthly or annually. You can join them, get in on the Slack at patreon.com/Politicoast. Politicoast is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicoast enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to politicstoday.news/free-trial. Let's start off with rounding up last week's Battle of the Greatest BC Premier bracket and get into this week's challenge. Last week we put up the Conservatives, Sir Richard McBride versus Simon Fraser Tolmie. Tolmie wins 18-16, somewhat of an upset. I gave Richard McBride the bye in this round because he served for quite a long time, won a number of massive majorities, and by many of those metrics, could be considered one of the greater premiers, especially of those early generations. But I think the racism did it. And I think also the bitter irony that, Tolmie running the Conservative Party of BC into the ground is almost something worth recognition for. Not many people can claim to do that to their party and to the province.
And here I was wondering if the submarine bit would help McBride clinch it, but I guess not.
This week we look at another two titans of the province, the finale, the championship of the social credit premiers, and it had to come down to this. It had to come down to dad versus son, WAC versus Bill, Will versus Bill, if you will. I don't think this one will be as close. Maybe there's some people out there with a fondness for Bill Bennett who don't like WAC Bennett more. We'll find out. But let's line them up again. WAC Bennett, Wacky, or CC, I still can't get over that, was the 25th Premier of British Columbia from August 1952 until September 1972, 20 years. And his mark is all over the province in the name of dams and the library at SFU and many things. WAC Bennett was born in New Brunswick. His family moved across Canada, slowly moving west, and he eventually moved to Kelowna, where he established a chain of hardware stores. I think he had 5 across the Okanagan named Bennett's Hardware. I don't think they're still in business, but maybe they are. He also launched one of the first wineries in the Okanagan. With a couple partners, they had started selling apple wines. Those did not do well, so they bought some California grapes, brought them up, and there you go. He entered the BC legislature in 1941 as a Conservative, went back and forth, sometimes ran for federal politics. In 1951, he sought the leadership of the Progressive Conservative Party of BC, but he lost that, so he quit that party, and he eventually joined the Social Credit, new party that had started up that year. He ended up becoming leader after that party was surprise elected to a minority government. They were one seat shy, and they managed to convince the independent Labour MLA to side with them. Bennett was the only one with substantial legislative experience, and so he won. He was appointed by caucus to become premier, and he quickly engineered a defeat for his government so he could run and win a sizable majority in 1953. He would go on to win in 1956, 60, 63, 66, 69, and finally lost in 1972 to Dave Barrett's NDP. You'll notice he did like to run elections every 3 to 4 years. So John Horgan could point to WAC Bennett's legacy as why he had to pull the plug on his minority government after 3.
Not sure a 50-year-old precedent's the best one to be pointing to.
I don't disagree, but I did find it funny that era we only had 3-year governments because they just, I don't know what the thinking was, but they had the ability to keep them up to 5. Bennett was elected. So Bennett comes in with social credit, and social credit in BC, when it was first founded, was essentially founded as a AstroTurf branch of the Alberta Social Credit Party. The original leader was actually an Alberta legislator. And so we came in with, or social credit comes in with all these kind of crank monetary theories about just like giving people, it's not universal, like basic income, but it's some weird economics. There's a lot of anti-Semitism baked into it, but
as tends to be the case with fringe economics.
Yeah,
theories.
W.A.C. Bennett comes in and this is dumb. It didn't work in Alberta when they first tried it, and provinces can't do fiscal and monetary policy, so let's not do any of that. And he just basically reforms the party into his own populist, conservative, anti-CCF vehicle.
Didn't the Alberta Social Credit try to do like a Alberta botch or something in their early days?
Yeah, there was some of that. The Alberta Advantage actually has a good 2-part history way back in their archives on social credit in that province, and it's just a wild ride. Much of that was a couple decades before W.A.C. Bennett came to power, so he did have the benefit of knowing what didn't work there, and he could just basically form social credit as what is a modern BC Liberal or Conservative party, just essentially a coalition of business, religious conservatives, free marketers, anyone you could find who doesn't want the quote-unquote godless socialists to get into power. Despite his endorsements and love of the free market, W.A.C. Bennett saw a lot of big spending in the province. He built highways, dams, railways, ferries, 2 universities in Victoria and Simon Fraser University. He founded the Bank of British Columbia, and he helped sign the Columbia River Treaty. So we have a lot of stuff thanks to him. Further, in 1955, he was one of the premiers who was advocating for universal medical coverage. He also went farther and said, we need dental, hospital, and pharmaceutical coverage. Some of those we're still waiting on today. Bennett was also good at keeping up the tradition of playing fast and loose with the books in British Columbia. He claimed we were debt-free in 1959. Largely, it seems like because he transferred a lot of the province's debts to like the highway agency so that you could just hide them. It's time-honored tradition.
Would not be the last time that's done.
On the other side of the aisle, he would cut social welfare spending, go after the unions, as all good right-of-center parties in this province have been wont to do. His 1972 election was painted as weirdly lackluster. It was almost like he presumed he would win, and Dave Barrett came in with quite the exciting campaign, and there were some weird vote splits that ultimately meant that W.A.C. Bennett and the social credit government was knocked from power. Bennett would resign in the subsequent leadership race. His son won. So let's pivot there. Actually, I should mention W.A.C. Bennett died in 1979 and is buried in Kelowna. Bill became the 27th premier in 1975. Like I mentioned, he took over the party after his dad resigned. There was a leadership race, but he did win that, and he would govern until August 1986. Not quite as long, but still 11 years is quite the respectable tenure as a premier. He won elections in 1975, 79, and 83, and towards the later years, he really pivoted and switched into the Milton Friedman-esque economics, really based around this program he framed as restraint. And the idea was our province is broke, we have no money, so we need to slash social services, we need to gut labor laws, we need to do massive cuts to the civil service. And this was unsurprisingly unpopular with many people in the province, so much so that it resulted in a general strike at the time, and quite the strife in the social sector. Bill didn't do as many big mega projects as his father, but he did establish the BC Winter and Summer Games. He was influential in bringing Expo 86 to Vancouver and everything that went along with that, such as SkyTrain, BC Place, and the Trade Center. And he also...
Yeah, SkyTrain's significant, and the unfriendliness to unions did manifest with that particular project in being one of the early places to adopt automated trains, which is something that has paid dividends for Vancouver in the decades since.
He was also really happy to use public-private partnerships and non-union contractors on projects like the Coquihalla, which we are now having to rebuild. And hey, you might get to drive on it again in the spring if everything goes well, it sounded like we were told today. Coquihalla is a good highway, though, but it just got wrecked by this year.
Yeah, it's hard to engineer a highway to resist, the entire highway and all the ground underneath it being washed into the Pacific.
So Bill Bennett's legacy isn't as deep. He was only premier for 11 years versus his father's 20. He survived until 2015, where he died in Kelowna. There was a note that he was convicted of insider trading in 1996. I don't think that was connected to anything he did while in politics. That was his legacy. You can vote WAC or Bill at Politicos Pod or politicos.ca/bracket. I think I know who's already going to win. I don't really want to bias it, but it's one of those contests where you have someone who led for 20 years and someone who led for 11, and while they both are pretty influential, vote for who you like. Who is the best? Let's switch gears and go to federal politics. The federal throne speech, they're back in the House. Before we even talk about the throne speech, let's talk about what didn't happen at the start of the week. We did not have a blow up of the Conservative caucus, Scott. They didn't get churned away en masse.
Yeah, that was the thing everyone was watching for, because there was the whole drama around Senator Denise Batters. It's not I keep wanting to call it the Freedom Caucus, but that's the U.S. Republican craziness. The Civil Liberties Caucus, with that and how many Conservative MPs were actually going to get excluded, how big a drama would this be, turned out to be a fairly uneventful day on that front. I do believe they eventually ended up, someone from the caucus raised the point of privilege on it, but ultimately it turned out to be a pretty minor thing.
It really seems like Aaron O'Toole has turned things around, at least within caucus. There's not this like open revolt happening. They had their moment of venting. They let their steam off. Batters went too far, so she's out. A couple stories got leaked about the size of his support within caucus and things. And I don't know, maybe he made the calls, maybe he did the work, but it seems like he's managed to get at least that side. Whether he can also bring the base on is the next question, but that's a less urgent and existential crisis for him. Yes,
and now that Parliament is back in session, there'll be the Liberals to go after and focus things on, whether it's the committees in this minority Parliament will no doubt be trying to restart the Winnipeg Lab investigation. There's inflation concerns. There's going to be that mess of a bill, C10 coming back. Just between all of those things, there will be things for the Conservative Party to unite behind and going after, which will probably help O'Toole. Especially because none of those seem to be really the things that particularly divide Conservatives.
Yeah, if I were Justin Trudeau, I don't know why I'd be bringing back C10 so eagerly, but we can get back into that when we talk about the throne speech.
Quebec.
Are they desperate for it, though?
It was apparently pretty popular in Quebec.
So, I guess the only other thing that happened at the start of the week is the speaker election. Anthony Rota was reelected as speaker, which didn't really surprise me. I think the Liberals liked him, and there was enough, whatever, among some of the opposition. And there wasn't a clear, here's who should be the alternate choice. And Elizabeth May ran for speaker, and that would have been fun chaos energy, but I couldn't tell you anyone else who ran without looking it up. So that's how important that was. Let's talk about the throne speech, though. Mary Simon's first for her tenure as Governor General. Boring, what you would expect given they just had an election, and so all of the commentary this is exactly what was in their platform. It's like, why would it be anything else?
I was going through looking at some of the other commentary out there on this, and you're absolutely right on it. There's very little insightful commentary on this because there isn't anything in here to be insightful about. It is about as cautious in a paint-by-numbers throne speech as you can have. It's the stuff that the government has already signaled. There's no big surprises in here. The only things of real note that are in here that maybe differed from the election campaign they ran was that inflation got a one-line mention as part of the cost of living and affordability section. And they maybe put a little more emphasis on climate adaptation after what's happened here in BC. But other than that, it is pretty much what you would expect.
Uninsightful commentary from everyone else, uninsightful commentary from us. Yeah, nothing new on the pandemic, just a rehash of the greatest hits. On housing, it was a focus, and some of the details will still have to come, but they talked up building more units per year, increasing affordable housing, launching the Housing Accelerator Fund, and helping people buy their first home with the first-time home buyers incentive, which we mocked during the election campaign, the rent-to-own program, which is, I guess we'll have to see it when it exists, and reducing the closing costs for first-time buyers, which is vague, and I'm not exactly sure if that means they'll be implementing their buyer's Bill of Rights stuff.
Yeah, nothing to excite on the housing front on that. There have been other governments in other places that have tried rent-to-own programs. I don't think any of them have been stunningly successful or anything.
I think the UK has one.
Yeah, I know they've had one. I think it dates back to the 80s, I think. But my general understanding was that wasn't generally a giant success story.
Like rent-to-own only works if you have homes to rent that you could then own. So you still have to build them.
Yeah, and also someone's going to be in a same place for quite a while on that. It's the Liberals' housing policy. It's really a mixed bag on most of that stuff, and there was nothing in here that showed they were unmixing sorting the whatever the opposite of that would be.
Similarly, on climate, there wasn't anything too ambitious. There was talk of green jobs. There was mention of capping and cutting oil and gas emissions.
That's probably the most significant part of there, at least in terms of newness in there, because the rest of the stuff, clean jobs, invest in public transit, EV sales, all of that stuff being talked about for years by this government.
Yeah, they still bought a pipeline, so we'll have to see what they're going to do to actually challenge the entrenchment of the oil and gas industry in this country. Throne speeches are so vague. We've covered them a few times. They're getting more vague every time. What was fun, though, was the super awkward pivot in the middle where they go from climate to gun violence in 2 lines and start trying to talk about implementing the mandatory buyback of banned assault weapons and the moving forward with provinces that want to ban handguns, which I remember as being about cities in the past.
That was how they ran it, or did it in the past. That was their big 2019 gun platform piece. That never made any sense. This is still not a policy that makes a huge amount of sense because handguns are so strictly regulated in this country that legally owning one, even if you legally own it, have all the licenses and everything you need for it, you pretty much can't ever do anything with it beyond go to a range, shoot a couple targets, and drive back directly back home to lock it up in your house. So it's not clear what letting provinces ban target shooting effectively, because that's the only thing you can legally do with a handgun in this country anyway, really does to add to safety here. Nevertheless, it does make more sense than having it being a patchwork of municipalities, which anyone who's looked at the map of the Lower Mainland here would obviously see as a challenging and flawed approach to implementing
To be fair, I think most municipalities in Metrovan would probably support a ban, just because
maybe
until you get to
Vancouver probably
Maple
would.
Ridge or further.
But let's say the university endowment lands don't, but there's no range there. So if you legally own a pistol in one on the endowments, could you travel through Vancouver to drive to the range out
you
in the
got to take
valley?
a boat. But I'm sure there's some heavy regulations
just like
around
a bunch
firearms
of,
on boats.
Yeah.
So
there's just like a bunch of dumb things like that, or like, why would it be safer for someone to own a handgun in Burnaby compared to Vancouver? It was a dumb idea then. This is moderately less
a patchwork
dumb.
of provinces is better than a patchwork of cities, as you always say. The Liberals are also committing again to a national action plan on gender-based violence, a renewed anti-racism strategy, and they plan to complete the ban on conversion therapy and conversion practices, something that will now take a third bill federally to try to do.
Well, they're fighting it with the BC government on how many bills it takes.
Yeah,
to
we'll
get
come back
passed.
to that, but at least the federal ones are government bills, which you think they could get passed if it wasn't for how good this government is not at its legislative agenda. Speaking of its legislative agenda, it also wants to reintroduce some bills to update the Equality of French and English Acts, strengthen the Official Languages Act, and like I mentioned, those changes to the Broadcasting Act that were quite controversial. So those will be fun to watch in the House. There was also some similar wording on reconciliation again. I didn't see any specific promises in there. There wasn't much on foreign affairs either, some like general liberal platitudes about we want a peaceful and democratic world of human rights and we're going to put some money in foreign assistance.
Yeah, there's one sentence about developing deeper partnerships in the Indo-Pacific and across the Arctic.
That is a wide swath of the world.
It's a wide swath, but it is moderately more strategically focused than anything this government has done with foreign policy in the last 6 years. So
I presume across the Arctic does not include Russia as much of the Arctic.
To me that means America, Denmark, Norway.
So that's the throne speech. The Liberals have been talking a lot in the lead up about the main things they want to pass in like the 4 weeks they have now, 3 weeks. Highlights included 10 days of paid sick leave for federally regulated workers, the updates to the recovery benefits that they had already essentially announced and just need some legislative enabling act to do, the conversion therapy ban, and reintroducing, I think Bill C-10 was on the top of their list.
So yeah, that's pretty much the throne speech. Honestly, this one feels more like formality than anything else. It does ultimately have to pass, but despite the NDP throwing a fuss about a few things that they would have liked to see in there that wasn't, they'll support it, so there's no real drama about whether or not the throne speech is going to sail through or whether the government will fail a confidence vote.
And it can get dragged out, as we've seen provincially, to really push it down. So, did you see anything interesting in the reactions? We can talk in a minute about Jagmeet Singh's Twitter thread. Aaron O'Toole is unimpressed, which is not surprising, though.
It's pretty much the leader of the opposition's job to be unimpressed with the throne speech. Like you said, unsurprising. They're hitting the inflation issue pretty hard, which is not unexpected. I think they're generally right to point out that the Liberal government hasn't always had its eye firmly on the economy the way it probably should have. But in terms of surprising takes from the Conservatives and Aaron O'Toole, there wasn't much particularly noteworthy. Like how the Liberals hit all the notes they needed to. The Conservatives more or less did too. Not out to lunch on it, but neither anything earth-shattering.
I guess similarly, the NDP are critical it doesn't go farther. Jagmeet Singh was highlighting concerns that pharmacare has been promised but hasn't come about yet. There's not a lot of support for workers transitioning away from fossil fuels. He really drew his red lines at clawbacks to GIS and CCB, Guaranteed Income Supplement, and Canada Childcare Benefit. And I think by clawbacks, he's referring to the fact the supplemental top-ups that were introduced to both of those programs during the pandemic aren't going to continue indefinitely, which, like, yeah, fight for me to get another $300 every 6 months, Jagmeet, but it's probably not those weren't, I don't think we were ever thinking those were permanent top-ups.
No, and it's appropriate for the government to start scaling back its COVID supports because we're on track for COVID to become endemic. We're going to have to get back to something that's approaching normal with probably a little more kind of general public health measures that I think are going to last longer. But on the personal and business supports, those were always short-term measures to not have the economy implode when people couldn't go to work. But as people are returning to work, we're continuing to vaccinate the population, with now kids being approved as young as 5 to receive the vaccine. With all of this, you do have to start transitioning the budget back to something that more resembled what it was in 2019, because you can't indefinitely spend a large percentage of GDP on these programs, no matter how much Jagmeet would like the government to do that, because it's just not sustainable or responsible.
Unless you drop in a wealth tax or some other funding mechanisms for them. But even if we did, I still think the top-ups to these two programs is probably not the highest priority in terms of how we, like, the childcare funding is something that will make clear differences in people's lives. But Singh's red lines are also to stop court cases against Indigenous kids. This is something they've been talking about for a while, and the Liberals looked set to do that a few weeks ago, but then they announced at the last minute they were appealing, but then they said they're pausing their appeal, which is not a thing you do like that. So I suspect the Liberals will be able to talk their way around this, but until those court cases are settled and no action is continuing, it's still a bad look for this government. The other three things Singh is asking for, the Liberals have been explicitly promising, so at least they're on the same page. This is the 10 paid sick days for federal workers, a ban on conversion therapy, and protections for violence for healthcare workers, which is the bill BC brought in, but will also come in federally.
Well, speaking of BC, if he wants to see action on some of those, he should probably, rather than haranguing Trudeau to do the things Trudeau said he's going to do, is call up John Horgan, because the BC NDP right now is lagging behind the Liberals on a couple of those, notably the 10 paid days of sick leave and the conversion therapy ban.
Neither of those exist federally yet. But I know a lot of New Democrats or lefties who, if they want Jagmeet to be yelling at John Horgan, to be yelling at him for the RCMP actions in Wet'suwet'en, and we'll get to all of that.
It is hilarious to watch federal NDP MPs be very opposed to what's happening while trying very hard not to mention who is governing the province where it's happening in.
Yeah, it is. Especially the most prominent lefty MPs like Matthew Green and Leah Gazan, but it was ever thus.
Yeah, it's the we're all trying to find out who's doing this meme come to life.
That feels like a segue into provincial politics, which is where we're headed. Federal politics will come back to where things get to next week. We have 3 more weeks of Parliament, presuming they don't get dragged out, as they tend to do. But we have news here in BC. Should we move on to it?
Yeah, a few things happened this week that aren't necessarily related to the ongoing disasters, although there's going to be impacts on some of those. Starting out early this week with the budget update that came out, showing the province actually in a better fiscal shape than projected, with a budget deficit that is going to be only 1.7 billion, which was significantly less than the 9.7 billion that was forecasted before. And this is largely because revenues are up from improved gains on the personal and corporate taxes, as well as some commodity price increases. So, all to say, basically, the economy is doing pretty good, which, I mean, may not hold after the province's transportation infrastructure got hit pretty bad, but up to November, it was definitely better than predicted.
Yeah. Like, I grew up in 90s, early 2000s Alberta, where budget forecasts and what got announced several months later always felt wildly different, especially under Klein, and it got to the point where you felt like every budget they were wildly projecting the revenues, especially from oil and gas. And then when the numbers came in, it's, oh, we promised you a couple $100 million. Actually, we have $10 billion. You feel like you're cooking the books a bit. Like, we know you should budget conservatively, but not absurdly conservatively. In this kind of situation, I'm willing to grant a lot of slack, and not just because it's the NDP, but because it was a pandemic, and I don't think anyone knew how the economy was going to go at any point during this. And even now, like with inflation starting to be a headline story, that might not be the case in a year. Like, it's pretty wild and unpredictable. So an $8 billion swing is not great from an accounting point of view, and a budgeting point of view, but at least it's in the right direction for the province. Although the opposition points out, it does suggest maybe I don't want to say we're overly reliant on taxation, other than possibly the property transfer tax, which, if our entire economy is built on real estate, is always a problem, which it has been for a while. But it does at least give the government some flexibility, and hopefully they can have a clearer budget in the next year.
Yeah, and like on the margin, you would expect the property transfer tax to be moderately cooling of the market, just because it is a bit of a drag on buying and selling, which would, in theory, edge down demand a bit. So if the market is going to be red hot, it is probably better that the province gets a slice of it than not from the government.
Oh yeah, I'm not about repealing that tax, just like the fact we make so much money off it suggests our province's real estate market is out of control, which is not news, and we don't need to hammer on that. What is well under control is the legislative agenda here in BC, as they wrapped up just on time after House Leader Mike Farnworth invoked time allocation on several bills this week, which allowed them to cruise through all the most controversial stuff in the most controversial way. Specifically, 2 forestry bills and the FOI bill, which we've all covered all of in the past few weeks, are now on their way to become law or already law, depending on where the Lieutenant Governor's signature has landed. I believe she's already gone in and signed everything. Yeah, they're all through, so get ready to start paying for your FOIs, friends. I do appreciate opposition House Leader Peter Milobar's comments on this. Vaughn Palmer's got a nice piece in the Vancouver Sun where he highlights how this approach of time allocation is a ping pong of BC politics now. He tracks it back to the late 90s. The BC NDP of the time brought it in to get more of their bills through. Obviously, the Campbell and Clark governments were happy to maintain that power, and the NDP screamed bloody murder every time it was introduced and used. And now John Horgan is invoking it as well. And so Peter Milobar says, last month this government spent weeks essentially filibustering their own miscellaneous stats bill because they had no serious legislative agenda. Then all of a sudden they've dropped large substantive bills and decided to ram them through without proper democratic reviews.
He's not wrong. The government the House had debates on the throne speech half a year after the throne speech happened because I guess they needed something to do because the government couldn't be bothered to get its legislation ready in time. Yeah, no, they're entirely right on this, that the NDP's just done a bad job on this and are using a trick of the legislative procedure to speed up and fix that error on their part.
Yeah, we were talking about this a little bit before the show. Like, the only way out of this quagmire back and forth approach BC might have had is if the Greens had been able to somehow break it while they were supporting the government, or if the BC Greens had teamed up with the Liberals during the minority years to change the way the House was run for the better, for the people, for democracy, as it were, that might have been the option. But I think the House is so like government friendly and like government directed that they didn't even have that opportunity. Like, I think the rules have been structured so heavily towards government that we're stuck with this. And I don't know if it's as bad in any other province or if it's just like different bads. Like I was told about in Manitoba, where they don't have time allocations. If the opposition doesn't like a bill, it's a test, but the government really wants to get it through. It's a test of who's willing to wait it out the longest. And you go into marathon sessions, which isn't good for anyone involved. Should governments be able to govern, Scott?
I think they generally should, but there's also a lot of hypocrisy when it comes to this. The Liberals accused the BC NDP and said that they demonstrated a clear disregard for the province. They represent the legal system, the colleagues from the and worse, they've further imperiled the trust and efficiency in the Democrats. And that's not wrong, but also the exact same thing happened on the other side. It's one of those things that you just bounce back and forth. And yeah, no, the NDP aren't really caring about democracy here, but that's what happens when governments stick around too long and why you actually need regular changes of power.
I think the worst thing about it is the cynicism it fuels, though, when the natural analysis is, well, they're all corrupt or they're all going to take advantage of these rules when they get power. And then they do. It just really
That's kind of human nature, though, isn't it?
Not entirely. There can be times when, like, the first thing Stephen Harper does when he gets into office is reforms a bunch of the accountability rules and manages to actually make some reasonable changes there. The last thing Chrétien does on his way out is change a bunch of the fundraising rules because it doesn't matter to him, his political aspirations anymore.
Yeah, but like those are notable for the fact that they were at the beginning or end of someone's time in power. And that, I think, just goes to what I was saying a few moments ago about why it is actually so important to have regular transitions of power in a democracy so nobody gets too comfortable with that sort of thing.
Sure. It would be nice if on one of those transitions of power in BC, we fixed the rules to support both sides or support a more equitable and productive debate, but that might be too inside baseball for most people to notice. And speaking of inside baseball, with the legislature closing, and we've teased it a couple times already, it means all the private members' bills die, including the BC Greens, much promoted by them, and many advocates and supporters, including myself, ban on conversion practices, which, again, dies on the order paper.
I feel like we've talked about this story so many times.
Well, this bill twice now. We talked about it when it was introduced last week, I believe, and now as it dies. But
also the first time it died.
And there were...
and when the BC Green Party was making a fuss over the fact that the government wasn't moving forward on the bill the first time it was going through. Feels like something that comes up once every 3 months on the podcast.
Well, it's one of those things where the BC NDP, it doesn't really make sense what they're opposing or why they won't do it. Like the paid sick leave for so long, which we'll get into in a second.
So the paid sick leave I actually get, because there's some potential downsides on the impact on businesses and everything. And I know the NDP is not the typical party to care about that sort of stuff, but it's generally good that they've, I guess, expanded beyond our government, particularly ideologically, on that. But like this one here, their talking point has been basically that you can't bill for it under the
MSP.
The MSP system. So it's not really necessary. But at the same time, that also means there isn't any potential downside to passing it, and so why not do it at that point? Even if it's an empty gesture, get the empty gesture on the board as a W for the government on it. And I think there's probably an argument that it's more than just symbolic, but even if you do think it is just symbolic, just do the symbolic thing. Stop taking a beating every time it goes through. And as we were just saying, it's not like they were particularly busy a couple weeks back in the legislature, that they couldn't possibly fit the bill into the schedule for second and third readings. So it's just altogether bizarre. And it's not even like this government is principled on not passing legislation that is not strictly necessary or anything, because the first thing the government did was kill the road tolls that no expert thought was a good idea.
What I don't disagree with any of that. What I'm also thinking is like they missed an opportunity. I don't think it's as strong now, but definitely in the last legislature when you had people like Laurie Thronis in the BC Liberal caucus to use this in the exact way the federal Liberals have been using it for a couple of years now to beat the Conservatives over the head with, which is you use it to draw out those dumb comments from the most regressive members. Imagine putting this to committee with Laurie Thronis in the committee, and then you can just clip those comments and be like, look at who the BC Liberals have in their caucus. I don't know that they have anyone left who would oppose it, and maybe Wilkinson would have been smart enough to keep Thronis on a tight leash there, but it would have made his life even more uncomfortable. So they missed that chance. Even the like pure crass partisanship, they missed the opportunity there. Instead, I guess they're just waiting for the Trudeau Liberals to hopefully pass it on the third attempt. Third time's the charm. But like I mentioned, paid sick leave was the other thing where they kept deferring like all the calls that this is good, this is something we need here, do it in some manner, especially at the start of COVID where everyone was pointing out like, you're spending money left. People need to be able to stay home from work, though, and they're not able to. And we're showing you many different ways. And then the feds promised something eventually that took a lot longer to come out. And then it was eventually shown to not be sufficient. And so they finally said, all right, by January 1st, 2022, you will have some number of paid sick days. And this week we got to know the number is 5, which was horribly predictable. It was frustratingly predictable, Scott, because they consulted on 3, 5, or 10 as though they weren't always ever going to pick the middle number.
I could see the case where they picked the big number as a look how, bold and progressive a party we are.
And like literally all the unions called for it.
Yeah, it's not really how this version of the NDP works, which it has probably been to their electoral advantage that they come across as the a pragmatic center-left government, not a particularly ideological one.
Everything is ideology, Scott. Come on. Everything is ideology, Scott. Come on.
But like Canadians generally prefer pragmatic, not rock the boat too much governments, and that is how the NDP is governed to their credit. So this just really fits that pattern.
The details of the program were pretty much already all announced. This is in addition to 3 unpaid days, so you could take 8 days off sick for just cold, flu, illness type sickness next year. 5 of them paid by your employer. Presumably for anyone covered by the Employment Standards Act. So this includes part-time workers. You must have worked at least 90 days to be eligible for these sick days. But once you have 3 months under your belt, you get 5 days paid sick leave per year, which is a good. We've talked about multiple times on the podcast how important these kind of policies are to ensure people can take the time off when they need it or when you have that sniffle, so that we're not spreading viruses and costing the healthcare system, costing productivity, and endangering lives, as it is the case with COVID. Now, as you mentioned earlier, the federal government is looking at 10 paid days for federally regulated workers, and Trudeau has also announced he's going to be pushing all the provinces to use that as a minimum bar. I don't know, maybe we'll be revisiting this in 3 or 6 months when Trudeau has reached a deal with Horgan to top up 5 to 10, and we'll have to do this all over again. But speaking of Liberals, the provincial ones here, BC, they're still in a leadership race, and they had a debate this week that you sat through. How'd that go?
For some reason, because I am interested in how this is going, and so I can provide commentary to our listeners, but I left the end of it wondering why I had bothered to. So this, I think, was also on Monday evening, and I'm not sure there's a huge amount to say on what it was. If you watched the first debate, it wasn't that different, except even lighter on policy. For all the talk of renewal that the candidates are saying, and I do not recommend playing a drinking game where you drink every time a candidate says renewal, because you will be dead from alcohol poisoning.
Oh, are they going to call it the BC Renewal Party?
Well, apparently, half of them want to rebrand the party, so maybe. But for all of that, it is, after an hour and 45 minutes, it is hard-pressed to actually to see what that means in practice from any of them. And there isn't really a good sign from all 6 people on that stage of what that actually means in terms of concrete changes to their policies, their positioning. There's talk of improving the culture and making it more welcoming, but even that's pretty vague. And you aren't even having the debate elicit that so much. About the most interesting thing in the entire debate was that the target of most of the attacks shifted from Kevin Falcon, who went into the first one as the front runner and pretty predictably took most of the fire, to Ellis Ross on this second debate, mostly on climate policy.
And that's fascinating, right? Because early in, when Ellis Ross first teased he was running, or when people asked, he was like, yeah, sure, I'm running. And it seemed like a joke. It seemed like his campaign wasn't that serious. And I think especially with Aaron Gunn being ruled out, that Ross is trying to position himself as the heir to the populist support. Like, he's not a full reactionary Trumpian populist by any stretch. He's far more interesting candidate than that. But I'm wondering if the pushback is to try to, is because he has momentum, or is it because the rest of the party doesn't want that?
I think he does have a little momentum, and the Ellis campaign was not particularly energetic. I think it took them something like 3-4 weeks to get a website up after he announced.
It was the softest of soft launches.
Yeah, it wasn't particularly soft in that he pretty clearly came out and did the whole "I'm running" thing. But beyond that, there wasn't. It seemed like it might have been not a serious campaign, but that seems to have changed. They've kicked into a higher gear for sure, and they're definitely, his campaign is definitely mounting a pretty strong go at it, and some of the initial speculations around that I don't think will be borne out by the time this is done. But why everyone else seemed to focus on him is interesting. I'm wondering what the internal chatter, or if anyone has done any polling on the race that has shown him in front.
I don't know. It's such a quiet race from the outside and from even the broader political commentary. With the legislature done and the race will be concluded before the legislature is back, we'll have to we'll hopefully see more.
Today was Shirley Vaughan's last day in the legislature as Liberal leader. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch. We still have a couple months left. The membership cutoff, I believe, is December 17th. So any of the listeners interested in voting, you'll need to make sure your membership is valid by that date.
And we'll hopefully line up some interviews between now and voting day so that you can hear from some of the other candidates. Let's turn now to one last BC story before we do a couple quick takes. Just quickly as a follow-up to last week, I mentioned the arrests at the Wet'suwet'en protests that have grown again, have renewed, and RCMP actions. One thing that happened after we recorded, I believe it was, is 2 journalists were arrested, Amber Bracken and Michael Toledano. Bracken in particular is a pretty prominent photojournalist, and it seems like both of them were known to the RCMP as journalists, and Bracken apparently has a file, or the RCMP have a file on her that they bragged about when at her court hearing, trying to play her up as someone they had been watching, which raises even more questions. Both were released on bail and a number of conditions. A lot of places have covered this because arrests of journalists raise an extra level of scrutiny. And I know there's been some challenge on this on Twitter about, is that worse? Are their rights more sacrosanct? And the answer is, of course, no. But the idea of press freedom is deeply important to a democracy so that we can at least know what's happening. And the RCMP are pretty clearly, at this point, targeting especially journalists from smaller outlets that they can feel they can push around. And so that's all problematic. And it rises to a political level when BC Green leader Sonia Furstenau asks the provincial public safety minister, Mike Farnworth, about this. And why are you concerned about press freedom? And he says, what I can also tell this member is when it came to the issue of the journalists, that went to the appropriate place in terms of the court, which issued a decision around bail in the undertaking, which journalists agreed to, and they were subsequently released. In other words, the judicial process worked appropriately, and that's as it should be, not being directed by politicians. And sure, he shouldn't be directing the courts, but also the police under his watch shouldn't be so brazenly violating charter rights of journalists after they've been repeatedly told not to by the courts. Like, the RCMP are fucking out of control. And that's what I wanted to say on that. And our public safety minister is not doing himself any favors by downplaying that. So
there does seem to be a mentality in a certain generation of politicians that it is imperative that there be no political direction when it comes to how the police operate, which makes a lot of sense in general, but probably has been you don't want politicians sending the police after their opponents, for example, but does seem to have been taken to an unhealthy level where it has moved into there really is no direct oversight at the political level on any of this, which also isn't great and is probably overdue for a rebalancing on that.
I'm still mildly hopeful about the Police Reform Act review, wherever in the process that committee is at. That's going to take its time and come forward with amendment or recommendations, and then that'll have to go through the legislative process and review. In the meantime, we still have a clear and present issue to deal with. Disappointing comments from Public Safety Minister, and hopefully we can see some more, this to be taken more seriously than just, it's totally fine that people were in jail for 3 days. The court sorted it out in the end. That doesn't have a deep... If you're a journalist who's thinking about going up there, now you risk being grabbed, put in jail for 3 days, and you might be ruled that was unconstitutional and you shouldn't have been arrested. In the meantime, you still had your gear stolen, or taken by the cops, the work you did deleted, and you lost your freedom for a few days. We're not in a good situation. And it really makes me want to be on not the Jason Kenney, Doug McCallum style, get rid of the RCMP, but they're not wrong that we should get rid of the RCMP. We just need to replace it with something better.
Well, at the very least, it's maybe not the case where we necessarily want to have the same organization that does national security investigations and policing and protecting the prime minister, also being the people doing traffic patrols in small town places and everything. The RCMP, I think, probably gets given too much, and as a result, isn't particularly as good as it could be on a lot of different things because it has such a broad mandate.
So I'll keep following that story. Yeah. And I guess just to close off the show, we'd be remiss if we didn't congratulate past guest of the podcast, Dr. Amita Kuttner, on being named interim leader of the Federal Green Party. They got the job, the open job nomination competition.
Yeah, last week we were talking about how the Green Party actually put up the job opening on their website, which is a rather unusual approach for a party seeking an interim leader, but I guess we know who, at least one of the people who applied to that, as this was announced earlier today, I believe.
Yeah, Kuttner becomes the first trans and non-binary leader of a federal political party, the first of East Asian descent, and the youngest, having been born in late 1990, which was not that long ago. So they're only 30.
Yes. That was 30
they're younger
years
than
ago.
us.
By a few months in my case, but yeah. This is a little earlier than I was hoping for there are now federal leaders younger than you to happen.
I'm interested to see how they do, how it goes. It's a mess. It's a disaster of a party. Best of luck, Dr. Kuttner.
And that has been Playtoast. Find links to everything we talked about at playtoast.ca. Support the show and get access to our Slack channel at patreon.com/playtoast. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Serge Plotnikoff. Playtoast is a production of Legend Boot Media, and editing services are provided by CHLY 101.7 FM in Nanaimo. Wash your hands and stay home. Thanks for listening.